right, looks like we're getting started. Good evening. It is yours truly, Dr. Pierre, your favorite board certified internist, and welcome to another episode of Real Physician Reacts. Now, this is your first time catching this. First thing I want you to do, shake your head with me, say, yes, I'm going to do it. I want you to like and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you are always aware of every time we drop this Real Physician Reacts. Now, I typically do this Thursday evenings about 9 p.m. I'm starting about thinking of dropping it a little bit earlier. Stay tuned for that. But that's why you got to subscribe to the channel and make sure you got that notification bell. So if I do change the time, you'll know exactly when this is dropping live. So this is my live weekly series where I just talk about something that comes across my timeline that I just like, all right, I got to talk about this, especially from the physician perspective. I think a lot of times for those who see physicians across the social media landscape, it's a very polished presentation. It's a very science, it's very clinical in nature. You don't typically get the real reaction that most physicians and most of my colleagues really want to give. But fortunately, you're here on this channel, and this is not an issue you have to worry about. Like on this series, you're going to get my real life, like, yep, I'm definitely like upset or perturbed or, even jovial about something that may come across my timeline. So this week, President Biden got my timeline in an uproar, and we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about, and I'm going to show a video later on to kind of to figure out what kind of transpired, because all I saw were headlines. President Biden says the pandemic is over. The pandemic is over. And like clockwork, and I mentioned this on my TikTok page, like clockwork, those who have been anti-government, anti-COVID vaccine could not wait to share that news. They couldn't wait to say the people who they've been anti of the past 2+ years, like, oh, we suddenly agree with them. So they were sharing it all over the timeline. And then on the flip side, I had my health content creators, my public health professional, my scientists going crazy because they're like, what is Biden talking about when he says the pandemic is over? I don't understand what this means. Someone please explain to me. So what I like to do, I always like to do my due diligence, especially because the way the internet goes, the internet can have your words misconstrued and have you have people thinking you said one thing when you really said another. So I had to go and search out this video. Apparently he was on 60 Minutes. He was going through, I think, it was 60 Minutes. I'm not sure if he talked the whole 60 Minutes time, but at least the clip that they got had him saying, you know what he actually said, the pandemic is over. So first and foremost, I want you guys to hear it in his own words. That way, again, you can kind of digest it yourself. Then we're going to get in and kind of explain, his point of view, or more importantly, what I feel his point of view is. Because I think, especially when we talk about, especially in the year 2022, depending on when you're watching this video or listen to this on a podcast, shout out to my Lunch and Learn listeners. When you hear the word pandemic, the definitions have definitely separated versus pandemic from a clinical response. And I think the pandemic from a social response. And I think that's where, and if you watch the video, you can kind of see where President Biden is leading when he says the pandemic is over versus where a lot of my clinical professionals are leading when they say the pandemic is no way over. So let's just watch this video just so we can get an idea of exactly what he means when he dropped that news.
Mr. President, first Detroit Auto Show in 3 years.
Yeah.
Is the pandemic over?
The pandemic is over. We still have a problem with COVID. We're still doing a lot of work on it. But the pandemic is over. If you notice, no one's wearing masks. Everybody seems to be in pretty good shape. And so I think it's changing. And I think this is a perfect example of it.
So let me pause there. Let me get my screen back on. So as you can kind of see, he alludes to it. He says, hey, the pandemic is over, y'all. And he said it twice. The pandemic is over. And then he gives this example, because I think a lot of times, especially when we're running to our sides of an argument, I want to know exactly what that person on the other side is feeling. Y'all guys know my feelings about those who are like pro, Trump and everything else. I still want to hear their side, just so I can have a good vantage point of an argument, because I need to know what they're upset about. So when I hear the pandemic is over and people are going crazy, one, I want to figure out, hey, what does President Biden mean when he says the pandemic is over? For facts. Right now, cases are still roughly between 80 to 100,000 on a daily basis. The only time it doesn't get that high is on the weekends. And I think that's just a reporting issue more than anything else. And that's just the new cases every single day, 80 to 100,000, especially here in this country. When we talk about the number of deaths, unfortunately, have been stable. So number of deaths ranging between that 300 to 500 deaths every single day due to COVID. So this isn't, from a clinical perspective, any sign of something being over. Do you agree? Yes or yes? Like if I told you that the cases were staying the same, that the deaths were staying the same, would you agree that I would say that COVID isn't getting better? Yes or yes? Like, again, if you're watching this on the video or you're listening to it on the podcast, make sure I want you to shake your head with me. So understanding that thought, understanding that, hey, okay, we know the cases aren't going down. We know the deaths aren't going down. What does President Biden mean when he says, hey, the pandemic is over? And he kind of alludes to it. He says, hey, look around. Like, no one's wearing a mask anymore. The events are opening back up. People are going outside again. And I made it a point. I actually did a video of this on my TikTok where I said that there is a social definition of the word pandemic that's been here since the start of the pandemic. Because for a lot of people, they did not take the pandemic serious until outside was shut down. Do you agree? Yes or yes? Like, if you, and again, it might not be you personally, but there's a lot of people who did not take this pandemic serious until basketball was shut down, football was shut down, baseball was shut down, until you couldn't go to the clubs, until you couldn't go out for your trips out of the country. That is when the pandemic got very real to a lot of people. Not when we were having cases rising, not when we were having the deaths we were having from COVID. It wasn't until, hey, you know what? The social lever has been completely affected. We're not even talking about the financial piece of it, where the markets crashed everywhere. We're not even discussing that. We're saying, no, everything for their eyes started when they heard the word pandemic, when everything got shut down. So if you understand that background, that some people, a lot of people, I don't want to say some, a lot of people feel that the pandemic didn't start until all of the social things around them got shut down. You should probably be able to understand why for them the pandemic has ended, because guess what? All of those social things have opened back up again. And more importantly, they're looking around and they don't see the number of people wearing masks who used to wear masks. They don't see, this place is closed for this place. They don't see, hey, social distance signs anymore. They don't see any of that. And for my health officials and doctors and nurses and everything else, all of those businesses that were giving us discounts, opening up early for us, they're not doing none of that no more. So society has moved on to say, hey, you know what? If out, and in the famous words, if outside is open back up, I'm outside. So there's a lot of people who are outside at this moment. And those people you're not going to be able to tell those people that the pandemic is getting better. You're just not. Because in their eyes, they never believed that the pandemic was about the number of deaths. The pandemic was about the number of cases. For them, that was never the case. At this point, at the time I'm recording, we now have 2 different boosters, one that is specific for the most recent Omicron variant around. We had to do which is not a shock, but it's not a surprise for those who've kind of been watching this for the past couple of years and understanding that, hey, you know what? And we did a video on this. Hey, this COVID vaccine is going to be a thing that's going to stick around. I don't think this is going to be a temporary Band-Aid and we're not going to have to worry about it in a few years. Like, no, we're going to have to deal with this COVID vaccine for a while. So when you have those people who are on my side, the clinical side, who typically look at the numbers, who typically look at the number of deaths, who typically still have to deal with now, especially when we talk about COVID, the issues with long COVID and the disability from COVID, we're screaming like, Biden, what are you doing? We're screaming, Biden, what are you doing? And I remember when the pandemic first started, I remember having to, again, wear masks up. I remember having to talk to families via FaceTime with their family members. There's a lot of people who aren't here. Again, we have 1 million+ deaths here in this country. There's a lot of people here who did not make it and who still aren't making it. Remember, I said 400 to 500 people are dying every single day. But for a lot of people, that's not moving the lever anymore. What moved the lever is when you told them their jobs couldn't open up because of COVID. What moved the lever when they said, hey, you got to wear masks everywhere you go. What moved the lever when they said, hey, you know what? We're not going to open up any sporting events. That's what moved the lever. And I mentioned, obviously, I'm in the state of Florida. And for those, drop a like or comment, especially if you're watching the video, if you're from the state of Florida. Certain states in this country have acted like the pandemic was over for a long time, because they said, you know what, I'm only looking at the pandemic from a social construct. I want my businesses to open back up again. I want people to, quote unquote, feel free to get COVID whenever they want. Like, that was their thought process. Again, I'm in the state of Florida. We're one of the states who thought like that. Versus others who looked at this pandemic as like, nope, I'm looking at it from a clinical side. I'm looking at the fact that we're still having a whole bunch more cases coming around, that we're still having deaths. Mind you, we are not, let me see, we're in the month of September. We're not 10 months removed from having $1 million case days. And by $1 million case days where 1 million people were diagnosed with COVID. We're not 10 months removed from that. So don't let people fool you into thinking that COVID has just gone away. That is not the case. And if you follow people like myself and others, we'll keep screaming from the rooftops like, hey, COVID is here. COVID is an issue, to worry about. Well, like next week, I'm actually doing my podcast next week, and my Medicine Mondays episode next week is actually on the bivalent COVID vaccines that are out right now, which I 100% suggest you get, especially if you've already been vaccinated. And if you haven't been vaccinated, I suggest you get vaccinated. But by this time, if you haven't been vaccinated, you're probably kind of figured out, like, I'm not going to get vaccinated. That's what you chose. Again, you run the risk, and others around you have to run that risk as well. So we have here an instance where now it's public. Now it's public exactly kind of where President Biden and the government are leaning when they say the word pandemic. And it's, mind you, their actions have already been screaming it. Congress has essentially refused to continue to fund more COVID relief. Now, mind you, they funded some monkeypox relief because it was getting serious. Thankfully, monkeypox is going in the right direction. We won't say gone, but it is going in the right direction. So they refused to fund more COVID relief. They have essentially scaled back a lot of the rules, from the CDC standpoint. They scaled back a lot of the rules due to COVID. So they've been telling you in their actions how they, attribute what the pandemic is to them. So this news probably shouldn't have come as much of a shock, but I think it was just the fact that, like, wow, they've actually said it word for word is what got people in a tizzy. Again, I'm not shocked. I'm not surprised. I've been saying this for a while, that when we talk about pandemics, it really depends on who you're talking about, and as far as what definition you derive from it when I say the word pandemic. If you're watching this on the video, go ahead and drop your personal definition of what you think the pandemic is. Are you on the side of the social construct of a pandemic, or are you on the side of the clinical construct of a pandemic? Because once you understand which side you rely on, then you understand how the other side's going to argue. You already understand it. And I think it makes for a much better sense of peace when you understand what one person is coming from. If in the year 2022, I'm not arguing over whether the COVID vaccine works. That would be a foolish argument. I know it works. All the numbers say it works. So that's not the argument. So if you're on that train, leave us alone. But now if you're on this pandemic train where you're trying to figure out which side of the pandemic am I on, again, the question becomes, and you have to ask this yourself, and I want you to ask this, is, do I agree with President Biden that the pandemic is over, or do I disagree that the pandemic is over? That is the question you got to answer. So again, I am yours truly, Dr. Barry Pierre. Thank you for checking in on another episode of Real Physician Reacts. Stay tuned. Make sure you are subscribed to our YouTube channel. Even if you're, especially my Lunch Learn listeners, if you're listening on the podcast, make sure you are subscribed to my YouTube channel. And because I think we are going to be kind of switching the times. I just want to test it. I'm in experiment mode, so I want to test what the time difference. Would that make any big difference? One way or the other. So again, I'm yours truly, Dr. Barry Pierre. Appreciate you guys.